At the height of its power, the British Empire ruled the seas, set the rules of global trade, and financed the world. London was not just a capital. It was the nerve center of international money. Wars were fought with British credit. Railways were built with British capital. Governments lived and died by access to British banks. For more than a century, Britain did not just project power. It underwrote it. That is what made its collapse so difficult to understand. Empires are supposed to fall to invasion, rebellion, or revolution. Britain fell in a far quieter way. There were no foreign armies marching through London, no enemy flags raised over Parliament. The empire died sitting at a desk, signing papers and rolling over debt it could no longer control. This is the story of how the most financially sophisticated empire in history destroyed itself. Not through recklessness, not through corruption, but through decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The British Empire did not collapse because it lost control of its colonies. It lost its colonies because it lost control of its finances. Debt came first. Decline followed. Before the 20th century, Britain had mastered the art of borrowing. During the Napoleonic Wars, it carried debts that would have crushed weaker states. But it survived because its economy grew faster than its obligations. Industry expanded. Trade surged. Debt was manageable because the future was larger than the past. That balance broke in the modern era. The First World War changed everything. Britain emerged victorious but financially exhausted. The war had been paid for with borrowing on a scale never seen before. Britain was no longer the world's creditor. It was a debtor. And worse, it owed money to a rising industrial power across the Atlantic, the United States. After 1918, Britain believed it could recover the old way, rebuild trade, restore exports, pay down debt gradually. The empire was still intact. The system still seemed to work. But the foundations had shifted. The global economy had changed. The pound was no longer unchallenged. American industry was larger, more efficient, and protected by geography. Britain was trying to finance a 20th century empire with a 19th century balance sheet. Then came the Second War. World War II did not create Britain's financial problems. It magnified them. It took an already strained system and pushed it past the point of recovery. Victory required spending without limit, borrowing without restraint, sacrificing the future to survive the present. By 1945, Britain had won the war. But it had mortgaged everything else. The empire was still standing. But the numbers underneath it were already fatal. By the time the fighting stopped in 1945, Britain's finances were already beyond repair. The war had consumed more than money. It had consumed the very mechanisms that once allowed the empire to function. Exports had collapsed. Overseas investments had been sold or seized. Entire industries had been converted to military production and left unable to compete in peacetime markets. The war had been financed almost entirely through borrowing. Britain borrowed from its own citizens. It borrowed from its colonies. And most critically, it borrowed from the United States. Every loan pushed the reckoning further into the future. And every year of war made that future harder to reach. Before the war, Britain earned its living by exporting manufactured goods and financial services. After the war, it exported almost nothing. Factories were worn out, cities were damaged, skilled labor was exhausted. Yet the debts remained exactly as they were. Interest did not care that the war was over. The government faced an impossible contradiction. To recover, Britain needed to invest in industry, rebuild infrastructure, and modernize production. But to do that, it needed capital, and the capital was already spoken for. Debt service came first. It always does. At the same time, Britain was trying to maintain the illusion of imperial power. Bases had to be funded, administrations paid, military forces stationed across the globe. The empire was no longer generating surplus wealth, but it was still consuming it at scale. Debt turned from a tool into a trap. The Anglo-American loan that followed the war was presented as rescue. In reality, it was life support. The money was not used to transform the economy. It was used to prevent immediate collapse. Food imports, fuel, raw materials, essentials to keep the population alive and the state functioning. And it came with strings. The most damaging was convertibility. By agreeing to make the pound freely exchangeable for dollars, Britain exposed its weakened currency to the full force of global demand. Sterling balances that had been quietly accumulated during the war were suddenly cashed in. Reserves drained rapidly. Confidence collapsed. The experiment lasted weeks. When convertibility was suspended, the damage was already done. Britain had proven to the world that its currency could not stand on its own. The psychological blow was as severe as the financial one. Once trust is broken, it is almost impossible to restore. From that moment forward, Britain was managing decline, not recovery. The government responded the only way it could. Austerity, rationing, controls, taxes, everything designed to stretch limited resources as far as possible. Living standards stagnated, consumption was suppressed. Growth remained weak. This was not temporary pain on the way to renewal, it was structural. The empire was still expensive, the debt was still growing, and the economy that once supported both no longer existed. Britain was caught between obligations it could not abandon and resources it no longer possessed. Every year, more money flowed outward to service debts than flowed inward from trade. The future was being spent to pay for the past. This is what economic suicide looks like. Not collapse, not chaos, just slow, grinding arithmetic. As the numbers tightened, the logic of empire began to unravel. Colonies had once been assets. They bought British goods, used British shipping, and generated steady income. But in the post-war world, that relationship flipped. Holding the empire together now required constant spending, while returns shrank year after year. Administration costs rose. Military deployments expanded. Political unrest demanded money Britain no longer had. Every attempt to maintain control required borrowing more, taxing more, or cutting deeper at home. The empire had stopped paying for itself. India was the clearest example. Before independence, India had been central to Britain's economic system. It supplied raw materials, absorbed manufactured goods, and held large sterling balances accumulated during the war. But those balances were not real wealth. They were promises Britain could not afford to keep. When India demanded the right to spend its money freely, Britain faced a choice: default or decolonize. It chose decolonization. This pattern repeated across the empire. One territory after another became financially untenable, not because Britain lacked military power, but because it lacked liquidity. The empire was dissolving under the weight of unpaid bills. At home, the consequences were visible everywhere. Rationing continued long after the war ended. Bread, which had never been rationed during the conflict, was rationed in peacetime. Housing shortages worsened, infrastructure decayed. The public was told to endure again and again for a recovery that never fully arrived. Debt dictated policy. Every major decision was filtered through the same question: can we afford it? More often than not, the answer was no. Investment was delayed, modernization postponed. Britain fell behind competitors who were rebuilding with fresh capital and expanding markets. The United States surged ahead. Germany and Japan, rebuilt under American support, modernized faster than Britain ever could. Their factories were new. Their debt burdens were lighter. Britain was trying to compete with one hand tied behind its back. The pound reflected this reality. Persistent pressure forced devaluation in 1949 and again later. Each adjustment made imports more expensive and eroded living standards. Each one confirmed what markets already believed. Britain was no longer an economic anchor. The psychological shift mattered as much as the financial one. For generations, British power had been taken for granted. Suddenly, everything felt conditional, dependent, fragile. Debt had done what no enemy fleet ever managed. It had turned a global superpower into a cautious, inward-looking state, focused not on expansion or leadership, but on survival. The empire was not collapsing in flames. It was being quietly dismantled by balance sheets. By the early 1950s, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Britain could keep the empire, or it could keep the economy. It could not do both, and the math had already made the decision. The final illusion to break was the belief that time would solve the problem. British leaders told themselves that if they could just hold on a little longer, growth would return, trade would recover, and the debt burden would shrink naturally. This had worked in the 19th century. It did not work now. The world Britain had dominated no longer existed. Global trade was reorganizing around new centers of power. The dollar replaced the pound as the backbone of international finance. American banks set terms. American markets set prices. Britain was operating inside a system it no longer controlled, servicing debts denominated in a currency it did not issue. Every year, interest payments drained resources that could have been used to rebuild. This was the quiet killer. Not dramatic, not sudden, just relentless. Debt locked Britain into a permanent defensive posture. Instead of shaping the post-war order, it reacted to it. Attempts to reform came too late. Nationalization, welfare expansion, and industrial planning were meant to stabilize society and prevent unrest. They succeeded politically, but economically they added new obligations to an already overburdened state. The government promised security to its citizens at the same moment its ability to generate wealth was shrinking. Borrowing filled the gap. But borrowing no longer financed growth. It financed continuity. It paid for imports. It covered deficits. It delayed reckoning. Each loan reduced future flexibility and made the next crisis harder to manage. Foreign policy followed the same pattern. Britain withdrew not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Military commitments east of Suez were abandoned. Global presence contracted, not with declarations, but with budget cuts. The Suez Crisis exposed the truth to the world. Britain still had ambition, still had pride, still had a navy. But it did not have the money to act independently. When financial pressure was applied, the limits were immediate and humiliating. The era of autonomous power was over. From that moment on, Britain's role was defined by alignment, not leadership. The empire that once enforced rules now followed them. Decisions were shaped by exchange rates, reserves, and access to credit. Debt had finished the job. What made this collapse so devastating was its invisibility. There was no single day when the empire ended, no formal surrender, just a long sequence of compromises, each one rational in isolation, each one narrowing the range of possible futures. By choosing to preserve stability through borrowing, Britain traded independence for time, and time ran out. The empire had not been destroyed by external enemies. It had been hollowed out from within by obligations that grew faster than the economy that supported them. This was not decline by accident, it was decline by arithmetic. By the time the full consequences were felt, there was no dramatic collapse left to witness. The empire was already gone in all but name. What remained was the aftershock, a nation adjusting to a smaller role constrained not by lack of talent or ambition, but by financial reality. The debt never disappeared. It lingered quietly in the background, shaping policy long after the imperial map had faded. Every government inherited the same limitation. Every budget began with the same calculation. What must be paid first? Interest always came before ambition. Even during periods of growth, Britain was operating with a handicap. Revenues that might have fueled innovation or expansion were committed elsewhere. The state became cautious by necessity. Risk was avoided. Big bets were rare. Stability became the priority, not leadership. This was the final transformation. Britain did not fall into irrelevance. It adapted. It accepted constraints. It learned to live within limits that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The empire had once financed the world. Now it was carefully managing its own balance sheet. Looking back, the tragedy was not that Britain borrowed. Borrowing had built the empire in the first place. The tragedy was that the conditions which once made debt productive had vanished. Growth slowed. Competition intensified. The system that had turned loans into power no longer existed. Debt became self-reinforcing. Servicing past obligations reduced future growth. Reduced growth made debt heavier. The cycle fed on itself until retreat became inevitable. Decolonization was not a moral awakening alone. It was an economic necessity. The empire was not abandoned because it was unwanted. It was abandoned because it was unaffordable. This is why the end felt anticlimactic. No invasion, no conquest, just paperwork, negotiations, and quiet withdrawals. The empire slipped away not with a bang, but with a ledger entry. The British Empire did not commit suicide in a single moment. It did so slowly, deliberately, and legally, by choosing debt as a substitute for power, by mistaking time for recovery, by believing that yesterday's financial tools would still work in tomorrow's world. In the end, the most powerful empire on earth was undone by the same force that governs every household and every business, spending more than it could sustain. That is how debt ended a superpower. The story is uncomfortable because it offers no villain to blame and no battlefield to point to. There was no enemy army that destroyed the British Empire. There was no single decision that doomed it overnight. What ended it was far quieter and far more familiar. Debt changed incentives. Once borrowing became the default solution, every problem looked solvable in the short term and unsolvable in the long term. Each loan bought time, each delay reduced options. Britain was not reckless. It was rational again and again in moments when rational choices still led to irreversible outcomes. The empire had been built in an era when debt fueled expansion. Trade grew faster than obligations. Industry outran interest. Borrowing worked because tomorrow was always bigger than today. After the World Wars, that assumption was gone. Growth slowed, competition intensified. The future no longer expanded fast enough to carry the past. From that moment on, the empire was living on borrowed time. Britain adjusted with dignity. It preserved institutions. It avoided chaos. It chose stability over collapse. But stability came at a cost. Influence narrowed. Ambition shrank. The country learned to operate within constraints that debt had locked in place. The world remembers the British Empire as a story of conquest and command. In reality, its ending was administrative. Budgets replaced battles. Exchange rates replaced fleets. The most powerful tool in global politics became the balance sheet. Debt did not destroy Britain's cities. It destroyed Britain's options. And once options disappear, power follows. By the time the final payments were made and the last imperial commitments unwound, the transformation was complete. Britain remained a nation of history, culture, and influence, but it was no longer a system-setting power. That role had passed to others with cleaner balance sheets and wider margins for error. This is the real lesson of the empire's end. Superpowers do not collapse when they lose wars. They collapse when they lose flexibility. The British Empire did not fall to rebellion or invasion. It exhausted itself trying to preserve a global role its finances could no longer support. Debt did not cause a dramatic crash. It caused a permanent narrowing of possibilities. That narrowing is what ended the empire, not suddenly, not violently, but completely.